in the rain for 2 hours, before finally getting 250 grams of coarse ground grain, 250 grams of oatmeal, 2 pounds of sugar, 100 grams of coffee substitute, and a can of kohlrabi. There still isn't any meat or sausage or real coffee. A crowd is milling around the corner butcher's, an endless queue on both sides, people standing 4 abreast in the pouring rain. What a mess. My line was abuzz with rumours. We've just surrendered Köpenick. They've taken Wunsdorf. The Russians are already at the Teltow Canal. The women seem to have reached an unspoken agreement. All of a sudden, no one is bringing up that subject. Talking in the queue, I find myself coming down a level both in the way I speak and in what I say, immersing myself in the general emotion, though this always leaves me feeling a little grubby and disgusting. And yet I don't want to fence myself off. I want to give myself over to this communal sense of humanity. I want to be part of it, to experience it. There's a split between my aloofness, the desire to keep my private life to myself, and the urge to be like everyone else, to belong to the nation, to abide and suffer history together. What else can I do? I have to sit it out and wait. Our days are accented with flak and artillery fire. Now and then I wish it were all over. These are strange times, history experienced first hand, the stuff of tales yet untold and songs unsung. But seen up close, history is much more troublesome. Nothing but burdens and fears. Tomorrow I'll go and look for nettles and get some coal. Small as it is, our new stock of provisions will keep us from starving. I fret over it the way rich people worry about their money. The food could be bombed or stolen, eaten by mice or looted by the enemy. Finally, I have crammed everything into one more box for the basement. I can still carry all my earthly possessions up and down the stairs with hardly any effort. Late evening, twilight. I paid Frau Goltz another visit. Her husband was there too, sitting in his coat and scarf since the room was cold and gusty. They were both quiet, depressed. They don't understand the world any more. We hardly spoke. Outside the building we could hear a constant tinny rattle, punctuated by the drum-like flak, as if someone were beating a gigantic carpet that hung all the way down from the sky. The courtyards echo the sound of the gunfire. For the first time I understand the phrase thunder of cannon, which until now has always sounded like a hollow cliché, such as courage of a lion or manly chest. But thunder is an apt description. Showers and storms outside. I stood in the doorway and watched some soldiers pass by our building, listlessly dragging their feet. Some were limping. Mute, each man to himself, they trudged along, out of step, towards the city. Stubbly chins and sunken cheeks, their backs weighed down with gear. "What's going on?" I shout. "Where are you headed?" At first, no one answers. Then someone mutters something I can't make out. Then someone else mumbles something, but the words are clear enough. "Führer, command. And we will follow, even unto death." They all seem so miserable, so little like men anymore. The only thing they inspire is pity, no hope or expectation. They already look defeated, captured. They stare past us, blindly, impassively, as we stand on the curb. They're obviously not too concerned about us Volk, or civilians, or Berliners, or whatever we are. Now we're nothing but a burden. And I don't sense they're the least ashamed of how bedraggled they look, how ragged. They're too tired to care, too apathetic. They're all fought out. I can't bear watching them any more. The walls are marked with chalk, by now smeared and running, evidently directing the soldiers to specific assembly points. 2 cardboard placards are tacked onto the maple tree across the street, announcements, neatly penned by hand, in blue and red letters, with the names Hitler and Goebbels on them. One warns against surrender and threatens hanging and shooting. The other, addressed to the people of Berlin, warns against seditious foreigners and calls on all men to fight. Nobody pays any attention. The handwriting looks pathetic and inconsequential, like something whispered. Yes, we've been spoiled by technology. We can't accept doing without loudspeakers or rotary presses. Handwritten placards and whispered proclamations just don't carry the same weight. Technology has devalued the impact of our own speech and writing. In the old days, one man's call to arms was enough to set off an uprising. A few hand-printed leaflets, 95 theses nailed to a church door in Wittenberg. But today we need more. We need bigger and better, wider repercussions, mass-produced by machines and multiplied exponentially. A woman, reading the placards, summed it up nicely. Well, just look what those two have come to. In the basement, 10 p.m. After my evening soup, I allowed myself a little rest in the bed upstairs before trotting back down. The full assembly had already gathered. There was less shelling today, and there has been no air raid yet, though this is the time they usually come. Nervous merriment. All sorts of stories making the rounds. Frau W. pipes up, "Better a Ruskie on top than a Yank overhead." The joke seems not very appropriate to her morning crepe. Next comes Fräulein Bain. "Let's be honest for once. None of us is still a virgin, right?" No one says anything. I wonder who among us might be. Probably the concierge's younger daughter. She's only 16, and ever since her older sister went astray, they keep her under close guard. If I'm any judge of young girls' faces, then 18-year-old Stinchen from the Hamburgs slumbering away over there is another. As for the girl who looks like a young man, I have my doubts, but she could be a special case. We have a new woman in the basement. Up to now she's been going to the public bunker 6 blocks away, which is supposed to be secure. She lives by herself in her apartment, but I don't know yet whether she's abandoned, widowed, or divorced. She has a patch of weeping eczema over her left cheek. She tells us, at first in a whisper but then out loud, that she's secured her wedding ring to her pants. If they get that far, then the ring won't matter much anyway. General laughter. Still, her weeping eczema might prove just the thing that saves her, which is worth something these days. Monday, 23rd of April, 1945, 9 a.m. The night was amazingly quiet, with hardly any flak. We have a new resident, the husband of the woman who was bombed out of her home in Adlershof, and who moved in here with her mother. He showed up very quietly, still in uniform. An hour later he was wearing civilian clothes. How could he get away with it? No one's even noticed, or else they don't care. Anyway, no one's saying anything. A hard-boiled soldier from the front, he still looks pretty strong. We're happy to have him. Deserting suddenly seems like a perfectly understandable thing to do, a good idea, in fact. I can't help thinking of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans standing their ground at Thermopylae, and falling in battle as their law demanded. We learned about them in school. We were taught to admire their heroism. And I'm sure that if you looked hard enough, you could find 300 German soldiers willing to do the same. But not 3 million. The larger the force, and the more random its composition, the less chance of its members opting for textbook heroism. We women find it senseless to begin with. That's just the way we are. Reasonable, practical, opportunistic. We prefer our men alive. Towards midnight I was so tired I almost fell off my chair. Where am I supposed to come up with a bed? So I staggered up the glass-strewn stairs and made my way to the first floor and the widow's couch, where I slept until nearly 6 a.m. Afterwards I was surprised to learn there'd been a series of bombs. I slept right through it. There were rolls at the baker's, the last ones. My last ration cards for bread, too. No new cards in sight. No decrees and no news either. Nothing. Not a soul cares about us anymore. We're suddenly mere individuals, no longer members of the tribe, the German nation. Old ties are broken. Friendships don't extend further than 3 buildings away. There's only the group of us, huddled in the cave, a clan, just like in prehistoric times. The horizon has shrunk to 300 paces. At the baker's I heard the Russians were in Weissensee and Rangsdorf. How many times have I gone swimming at the lake at Rangsdorf? The Russians in Rangsdorf. I say it out loud, just to try it out, but it doesn't sound right. Today the eastern sky was burning red with the constant fires. Back from getting coal, 1 p.m. Heading south, I could feel I was literally marching towards the front. They've already closed off the S-Bahn tunnel. The people standing outside said a soldier had been hanged at the other end in his underwear, a sign with the word traitor around his neck. His body was dangling so close to the ground you could spin him around by the legs. The person who said this had seen it himself. He'd chased off the street kids who'd been amusing themselves. Berliner Strasse looked desolate, half torn up and barricaded off. Queues in front of the stores. Blank faces amid the flak. Trucks were rolling into town. Filthy figures in shabby bandages trudged alongside, their bodies sprayed with dirt, their faces empty. A baggage train of hay carts, grey-haired men on the boxes. Volkssturm units are posted at the barricade in motley uniforms hastily pieced together. You see very young boys, baby faces, peeping out beneath oversized steel helmets. It's frightening to hear their high-pitched voices. They're 15 years old at the most, standing there looking so skinny and small in their billowing uniform tunics. Why are we so appalled at the thought of children being murdered? In 3 or 4 years, the same children strike us as perfectly fit for shooting and maiming. Where do you draw the line? When their voices break? Because that's what really gets me the most, thinking about these little boys. Their voices so high, so bright. Up to now, being a soldier meant being a man, and being a man means being able to father a child. Wasting these boys before they reach maturity obviously runs against some fundamental law of nature, against our instinct, against every drive to preserve the species. Like certain fish or insects that eat their own offspring. People aren't supposed to do that. The fact that this is exactly what we are doing is a sure sign of madness. No one was at the publishing house. The building was completely abandoned, the basement full of coal. The woman relocated to our building had a problem and plied me with questions about what to do. Her oldest daughter is the mother of an 8-week-old infant. It seems that yesterday she stopped giving milk, so that all of a sudden she can no longer nurse her baby, and the little one has been bawling. Everyone's worried how the mother will pull the child through, now that there's no more cow's milk. I suggested to the young mother that eating some wild vegetables might help bring on her milk. Together we bent over the grass in the garden, which was soaked through with rain, and pulled up the young nettle shoots alongside the wall, using handkerchiefs to protect our hands. Then dandelions, the few we could find, smell of plants and soil, primrose, red hawthorn, spring. But the flak keeps yapping away. I filled a pack with hard coal and probably carried off 50 pounds. Yet even with the load, I managed to overtake another troop of soldiers on my way back. I saw my first weapons in several days. 2 bazookas, 1 submachine gun, ammunition boxes. Young guys wearing their cartridge belts like some barbaric adornment. A little before noon there was a burial on our street, or so I was told. The pharmacist's widow had been there. A 17-year-old girl. Grenade, shrapnel, leg amputated, bled to death. Her parents buried her in their garden behind some currant bushes. They used their old broom cupboard as a coffin. So now we're free to bury our dead wherever we wish, just as in ancient times. It makes me think of the time a huge Great Dane died in my old apartment building and wound up being buried in the garden. But what a scene beforehand! The landlord, the concierge, the other tenants, everybody fought against it. And now they bury a human being, and nobody gives it a second thought. In fact, I think the parents find comfort in their daughter being so close. And I catch myself assigning graves in our own little bit of garden.
End of Side 1. Side 2.
4 p.m. in the attic. I just had an amazing experience. I was visiting Frau Goltz and started playing with the telephone, just for fun. To my amazement, I could hear something, despite the fact the line has been dead for days. I dialed Gisela's number and managed to get through to her, even though she lives an hour away in Berlin West. We were so eager to hear what the other had to say we couldn't stop talking. It turns out her company has just collapsed. Her boss gave a rousing speech and then fled to the west, leaving the little people to fend for themselves. We're completely forgotten. We strain our ears to the void. We're all alone. Gisela told me she's exactly as old as her father was when he fell at Verdun in the First World War, almost to the day. She never saw her father. Now she says she can't stop thinking about him. She talks with him in spirit, as if her time were coming, as if she was going to meet him soon. We never spoke about such things before. We would have been embarrassed to bare our hearts like that. Now the deepest layers are pushing to the surface. Farewell, Gisela. We've each lived our 30 years or so. Maybe we'll see each other again some day, safe and sound. Back in the cave, Monday, 8 p.m. Today the first artillery hit our corner. Whizzing, hissing, howling. Whee! Flames flashing up. Terrified shouts in the courtyard. Stumbling downstairs, I could hear the shells landing right outside the cinema. The enemy is shooting at us. Incidentally, people say the Russians are sticking to the smaller guns, and we're beginning to feel a little less terrified about the American carpet bombing, since at least here in Berlin they'd wind up hitting Russians as well. A new rumour floats around the basement, which the wife of the liquor distiller heard from a reliable, very secret source and announces with a heaving bosom. The Yanks and Tommies have quarrelled with Ivan and are thinking of joining with us to chase Ivan out of the country. Scornful laughter and heated discussion. The woman is offended and gets so angry she slips into her native Saxon dialect. She just returned yesterday to her apartment and our basement from their somewhat small distillery behind Moritzplatz, where she and her husband had been spending the nights, so she could hold the fort at home. Her husband stayed with the bottles and vats, and a redhead named Elvira, as everyone in the basement knows. People are still taking care of business. Just before the shops closed, I managed to get another 150 grams of coarse grain. Suddenly I heard excited screams around the corner and the sound of running feet. A wagon was being unloaded near Boller's. Barrels of butter, all rancid, were being carried into the building for distribution. £1 per person. And here's what's frightening, for free. All you have to do is get your card stamped. Is this the first sign of panic, or is it the voice of reason speaking from beyond the bureaucratic files? Right away people start crowding outside the shop door, pounding one another with umbrellas and fists. I joined in the pushing too for a few minutes, and in the process overheard talk of reserves, reinforcements, and German tanks from somewhere. One woman claimed to have picked up something like that last night over the radio detector. Then I decided to let butter be butter. I didn't want to get into a fist fight over it, at least not today. But maybe I'll have to learn how soon. Silent night, distant pounding. Not a peep from the cave dwellers, not a word. They're too exhausted. Only snoring and the short, shallow breaths of the children. Tuesday, 24th of April, 1945. Around noon. No news. We're completely cut off. Some gas, but no water. Looking out of the window, I see throngs of people outside the stores. They're still fighting over the rancid butter. They're still giving it away, but now it's down to £1/4 per ration card. The Schutzpolizei are just now getting things under control. I see 4 of them. And on top of that, it's raining. At the moment I'm sitting on the window seat in the widow's apartment. She's just stormed in, all worked up. A shell hit outside Hefter's meat market, right in the middle of the queue. 3 dead and 10 wounded, but they're already queuing up again. The widow demonstrated how people were using their sleeves to wipe the blood off their meat coupons. Anyway, only 3 people died, she said. What's that compared to an air raid? No question about it. We're spoiled, all right. Still, I'm astounded at how the sight of a few beef quarters and hog jowls is enough to get the frailest grandmother to hold her ground. The same people who used to run for shelter if 3 fighter planes were spotted somewhere over central Germany are now standing in the meat line as solid as walls. At most they'll plop a bucket on their heads, or perhaps a helmet. Queuing is a family business, with every member on shift for a couple of hours before being relieved. But the line for meat is too long for me. I'm not yet ready to give it a go. Besides, meat has to be eaten right away. It won't keep for more than a meal. I think they're all dreaming of eating their fill one last time, a final meal before the execution. 2 p.m. Just caught a glimpse of the sun. Without giving it a second thought, I strolled out to the balcony overlooking the courtyard and sat down in my wicker chair, basking in the sun, until a formation of bombers whizzed by overhead and one explosion merged into the next. I'd actually forgotten there was a war on. As it is, my head is oddly empty. Just now I jerked up from my writing. Something fell close by, and I heard the clink of shattering glass. Once again I'm having hunger pangs on a full stomach. I feel the need to gnaw on something. What's the baby who's still nursing supposed to live off now, the baby who can't get any milk? Yesterday the people queuing up were talking about children dying. One old lady suggested that a piece of bread chewed up and full of saliva might help the little ones when they can't get milk. An infant in the city is a sorry thing indeed, when its elaborately constructed supply of milk has been disrupted. Even if the mother manages to find something for herself and get halfway nourished, the source is bound to run dry soon enough, given what is approaching us so mercilessly. Fortunately, the youngest child in our basement is already 18 months old. Yesterday I saw someone slip the mother a couple of biscuits for the baby, in what was likely the only recent act of giving. Most people squirrel away whatever they have, and nobody thinks about sharing anything with anybody. Back in the basement, 9 p.m. Towards evening, a woman we didn't know showed up and asked the widow and me to go with her to help in the field hospital. Smoke and red skies on the horizon. The east is all ablaze. They say the Russians have already reached Braunaustrasse. Ironic, considering that it was in Braunau that Adolf first saw the light of day. That reminds me of a quip I heard yesterday in the basement. Just think how much better off we'd be if his old lady had had a miscarriage. When we reached the hospital, the whole place was filled with smoke. Men were running about wildly, screaming and hollering. An ambulance driver, "Hey, we've got a shot lung with an impacted bullet." "Move! Go away! Didn't you hear? We don't have a single bed left." The ambulance driver is fuming. "This is where they told me to go. Go away, or else!" The sergeant threatens with his fists. The driver storms off, cursing. Lightly wounded men go slinking through the corridor, one barefoot, his bleeding hand wrapped in his socks. Another, also barefoot, leaves bloody footprints as he walks. The soles of his feet squelch as he lifts them off the ground. Waxy yellow faces peek out of head bandages, with rapidly spreading stains of red. We look into 2 or 3 other rooms. It's very stuffy, a smell of men, bivouacs, nervous apprehension. One man snarls at us. "What do you want?" The woman who'd come to get us answers shyly that a man in a truck had driven by shouting that the field hospital needed women to help. "That's nonsense. We don't have anything for you to do here. Go back home." So they don't want female help. But what a peculiar tone! So dismissive, disdainful. As if we wanted to get our hands on the guns or play at being soldiers. Here too I have to relearn everything I've been taught about women in war. Once our role was to play the ministering angel, scraping up lint for bandages, a cool hand on a man's hot brow, at a healthy distance from the shooting. Now there's no difference between a regular hospital and a field hospital. The front is everywhere. Admittedly, this particular hospital is trying to remain a kind of island in the midst of the storm. The roof is painted with gigantic crosses, and white sheets have been spread out in the form of a cross on the yard in front of the building. But aerial missiles are impartial, and the carpet of bombs is tightly woven with no holes for compassion, which they know in the field hospital, otherwise they wouldn't have crammed everyone down in the basement the way they have. Men's faces peer out of every barred window. Back in the shelter, the cave dwellers are feverish with excitement, agitated, nervous. The woman from Hamburg tells me with her sharp S's that they've managed to phone some friends on Müllerstrasse in North Berlin. "We're already Russian," her friend shouted into the telephone. "The tanks just rolled in down below. Masses of people are lining the streets. The Ivans are all laughing and waving and holding up babies." It could be true. That's an old communist district known as Red Wedding. Her story immediately sets off a heated argument. Some people wonder whether our propaganda has simply made fools of us. So they aren't as bad as we thought after all. But then the refugee from East Prussia, who otherwise never says a word, starts yelling in her dialect, broken sentences. She can't find the right words. She flails her arms and screams, "They'll find out all right," and then goes silent once again. As does the entire basement. The distiller's wife is peddling yet another rumour. Von Ribbentrop and von Papen have just flown to Washington to negotiate with the Americans in person. No one answers her. The basement is full of gloom. The kerosene lantern is smouldering. The phosphor rings painted at eye height on the beams so no one bumps into them in the dark give off a greenish glow. Our clan has increased. The book dealers have brought their canary. The cage is hanging off a joist, covered with a towel. Shelling outside, and silence within. All dozing or asleep. Wednesday, 25th of April, 1945, afternoon. To recapitulate. Around 1 a.m. I left the basement again to go up to the first floor and throw myself on the couch. All of a sudden there was a fierce air raid. The flak started raging. I simply lay there and waited, too sleepy to care. The window pane is already broken, and the wind is blowing in, along with the stench of fires. I felt an idiotic sense of security under the bed covers, as if the sheets and blankets were made of iron, though they say bedding is extremely dangerous. Dr. H. once told me how he'd had to treat a woman who'd been hit in bed. The bits of feather had lodged so deeply in her wounds he could barely remove them. But there comes a time when you're so mortally tired you stop being afraid. That's probably how soldiers sleep on the front, amid all the filth. I got up at 7 a.m. and the day began with quaking walls. Now the fighting is moving in our direction. No more water, no gas. I waited for a minute that was halfway calm and raced up the 4 flights of stairs to my attic apartment. Like an animal backing into his lair, I crept into one room at a time, always on the lookout, ready to beat a hasty retreat. I grabbed some bedclothes and toiletries and fled back downstairs to the first floor to the widow. We get along well. These days you come to know people quickly. Buckets in hand, I made my way to the pump, through the garden plots which were in full bloom. The sun was beating down, very warm. A long line at the pump, everyone pulling for himself. The lever was squeaky and difficult to move. Then the 15 minutes walk back with splashing buckets. We are all of us fine sumpter asses and she-asses. Nietzsche, I think. Outside Boller's they're still shoving one another on account of the free butter, and in front of Myers there's an endless dark queue, all men. They're selling liquor there, half a litre per ID card, anything they have. Right away I turned round and made a second trip for more water. A sudden air raid on my way home, a column of smoke and dust rising over the patch of grass outside the cinema. 2 men threw themselves flat on the ground, right in the gutter. Some women bolted for the nearest entranceway and ran down any stairs they could find, with me at their heels, into a completely unfamiliar basement that didn't have a trace of light. And all the time I couldn't let go of those buckets, otherwise they'd be stolen. A crowd inside the pitch-dark room, startled, very eerie. I heard a woman's voice moaning, "My God, my God," and then things went quiet again. Was she praying? I remember an event from about 2 years ago. See myself back in that hole, the most pitiful basement imaginable, under a one-story cottage. A village of 3,000, a place of no significance, but conveniently located on the way to the Ruhr Valley. A candle was burning in the dark, and the women, there were hardly any men, were reciting the rosary, the sorrowful mysteries. I can still hear their droning. "And for us was cruelly scourged," and then more, the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, monotonous, muted, soothing, freeing, just like I imagine the Om Mani Padme Hum of the Tibetan prayer wheels, only broken by the occasional hum of motors and once by a series of bombs that set the candle flame shivering. And then they went on, "And for us carried his heavy cross." Back then I could literally feel the prayer spreading its coat of oil over the troubled faces, helping make things better. Since that time I haven't been inside another shelter where people prayed. Here in Berlin, in this motley mix of 5-story tenements, you'd be hard-pressed to find a group of people willing to come together and say the Lord's Prayer. Of course people whisper prayers, perhaps more than it seems, and people do moan, my God," but the woman moaning probably doesn't understand what she's really saying. She's only grasping at empty phrases, repeating the words by rote, without meaning. I never liked the proverb, "Need teaches prayer." It sounds so haughty, like need teaches begging. Prayers extorted by fear and need from the lips of people who never prayed when times were good are nothing more than pitiful begging. There is no proverb that says, "Happiness teaches prayer," but a genuine prayer of thanksgiving ought to rise as high and as freely as fragrant incense. But this is all speculation. The fact that our German word for praying, beten, is so close to our word for begging, betteln, obviously means something. After all, there was a time when beggars were as much a fixture at the church door as the handle, as legitimate as the king himself and every bit as graced by God, so that the king would have his exact opposite here on earth, and so that whoever prayed to God in supplication would have someone to whom he in turn could extend divinely sanctioned charity. But I never will find out whether the moaning in the dark basement really was a prayer. One thing is certain, it's a blessing to be able to pray easily and unabatedly, amid the oppression and torture, in all our despair and fear. People who can do it are lucky. I can't. Not yet. I'm still resisting. After I came back from getting water, the widow sent me to the meat queue to find out what's going on. People were cursing. Evidently they keep postponing the deliveries of meat and sausage, which maddens these women more than the entire war. That's our strength. We women always focus on the task at hand. We're happy whenever we can flee into the present to escape worrying about the future. And for these women the task at hand is sausage, and the thought of sausage alters their perspective on things that may be much more important, but are nevertheless much further away. Back in the cellar, around 6 p.m. I couldn't lie down upstairs any longer. There were some hits close by, and I got scared when thick pieces of plaster started falling on my blanket. I dozed down here until Henny came from the baker's and reported that a bomb had landed right on the pharmacist's next to the cinema. The owner was killed on the spot, though it was impossible to say whether by shrapnel, the blast, or a heart attack. According to Henny, he didn't bleed. One of the 3 elderly pudding sisters got up and asked, with elegantly pursed lips, "If you don't mind, how did he get finished off?" That's the way we talk these days. That's how far we've fallen. The word shit rolls easily off the tongue. It's even spoken with satisfaction, as if by saying it we could expel our inner refuse. We are debasing our language in expectation of the impending humiliation. Thursday, 26th of April, 1945, 11 a.m. My fingers are shaking as I write this. 30 minutes ago we took a direct hit on the 4th floor. We're still breathing the dust from the plaster. I'm out of breath, having just raced back down from my apartment in the attic. The place looks like a dump, full of shattered plaster and splinters and broken glass. Farewell, my fleeting bit of home. I hardly had a chance to know you. For the moment you've been rendered uninhabitable. I grabbed what I could, a pot, some towels, some gauze for bandages, things we need. My throat is parched, still burning from the dust. I don't have anything to drink down here, and countless gallons of water have just drained out of the radiators upstairs. We spent... Wait. First, I want to recount everything that's happened. There's been so much, it's so long since I last wrote. It all started yesterday around 7 p.m. when someone came to our basement and announced that they were selling pudding powder at the corner store. I went along with everyone else and queued up. Then, out of the blue, Russian bombs. At first the queue merely regrouped in the ruins of the building next door, as if the broken walls would protect us from the bombs. Smoke and flames were coming from Berlinerstrasse. Another series of bombs exploded closer by. I gave up on the pudding powder and hurried across the street and back to the basement. A man called out to me, "Stick to the wall!" Rattling gunfire, flying debris. Back in the shelter at last, pudding or no pudding. The wife of the concierge started wailing that her daughter was still at the corner store. She probably hadn't felt it was safe to cross the street under fire. She showed up half an hour later, also without any pudding powder. She was pretty damn lucky, as she put it, having just managed to squeeze into the shop's basement when a bomb fell right outside. A teenage boy who hadn't made it inside caught a fragment in his skull. She had to step over his body on her way out. She pointed to her temple and showed us how the wound was gushing white and red. Tomorrow they're supposed to resume selling the powder. Evidently the store has plenty left. The cave dwellers went to sleep around 9 p.m. The widow has made a sort of bed for me as well, in the front area of the basement, since there isn't any space left close to the support timbers. But it's soft and warm. I slept until the bombs woke me up. My hand was dangling over my bed and I felt something licking it. Foxel, our absent landlord's terrier. There, Foxel, good dog. Don't be afraid. We're alone here in this front room. There's no support structure, but the air is cleaner and nobody bothers us with snores and groans. Up early the next morning to fetch water at the pump. I read my first printed text in days, hot off the press too. A newspaper called The Armoured Bear. Someone pasted one next to the baker's display window. It had Tuesday's official Wehrmacht report, which meant it was 2 days old. According to a report, A, the enemy was pushing ahead, and B, German reinforcements were on the way. The Bear also said that Adolf and Goebbels were still in Berlin and would stay. One very smug piece told of a soldier named Höhner, who had deserted and was now dangling from a rope at the Schönberg station for all to see. Breakfast in the basement. Everyone is trying as best they can to recreate some semblance of family life. A genteel morning meal served on trunks, crates and chairs, with paper napkins and little tablecloths. Pots of hot drinks cooked over wood fires or spirit stoves are lifted out of their cosies. You see butter dishes, sugar bowls, jam servers, silver spoons, everything. The widow conjured up some real coffee and cooked it on a fire made of broken champagne crates. That did us good. But people are fidgety, cranky, getting on one another's nerves. A little before 10 a.m. a trunk-sized bomb landed on the roof of our building. A terrible jolt, screams. The concierge's wife staggered in, pale as a sheet, bracing herself against one of the support beams. Then came 18-year-old Stinchin with the Hamburg S, leaning on her mother. Her hair was grey with plaster dust, completely tangled, and covering her young face, which was streaked with trickles of blood. She'd been hit while crossing the courtyard. Even the canary in its cage felt the general agitation, which was zigzagging back and forth as it cheeped away. It wasn't until 15 minutes later that someone noticed that the radiators were losing water. We ran upstairs. Well, not all of us. The postmaster's wife, for example, waved around a medical certificate and shouted that her husband had a heart condition and couldn't come along. And curtainman Schmidt lost no time in pressing his old spotted paw against his heart. Others hesitated as well, until Fräulein Bain bellowed like a lead mare, "You dopes are sitting there babbling while your homes are about to float away," and charged ahead without turning round to see who followed. I joined some 15 others in going after her. Up on the 3rd floor, a whole ocean of water was rushing out without stopping. We waded up to our ankles, wrung out the rugs, slaved away as it continued to pour from upstairs. We used dustpans to scoop it up, and then we dumped it out of the window, just like that, into the street, so brightly lit by the sun and so utterly deserted. Shells kept exploding the whole time, many of them quite close. Once a flurry of shattered glass and bits of plaster splashed into the water, but no one was hurt. After that we headed back to the basement, damp but quite excited. I hunkered down, squatting on wet socks, my feet still inside them, of course, and wondered whether the whole effort had been a smart thing to do. I'm not sure. In any case, it was very soldierly. Lieutenant Bain had charged ahead, an assault troop of volunteers followed, and everyone risked their lives to secure the endangered position, all under enemy fire. It clearly wasn't just about possessions either, about people rescuing their carpets, since practically none of the ones who went along had any more to do with those apartments than I did. We followed orders blindly, without looking to save our skins. Except that there will be no books or songs to celebrate this deed, and no one will receive the Iron Cross. Still, I now know one thing. In the heat of battle, in the thick of the action, you don't think. You don't even feel afraid because you're so distracted and absorbed. Were we brave? Most people would probably say we were. Was our lead mare, Fräulein Bain, a hero? If she really were a lieutenant, she would have definitely been given the Iron Cross. In any case, I have to rethink my ideas about heroism and courage under fire. It's only half as bad as I thought. Once you've taken the first step, you just keep charging ahead. It's also typical that while I was slogging through all that water, I didn't give my own apartment a second thought. Not until some others mentioned the possibility that it might have been hit. So I flew upstairs and found the dump described above. That means that from here on in I'll have to stay with the widow. It's perfectly fine with her. She's afraid of being alone in her apartment. In March they came and took her tenant to serve in the Volkssturm. Who knows whether he's still alive or not? But that's just a thought, not something you say out loud. 4 hours later, 3 p.m., back in the basement. Once again I'm out of breath, once again my fingers are shaking, and with good reason. Around noon things calmed down a little outside, so I went to the entryway to warm my damp back in the sunlight. The baker was next to me. A man came running past. He was coming from the former police barracks, most recently used by the Luftwaffe, and was carrying a loin of beef, dripping fresh. "Better be quick. They're giving it all away." We looked at each other and took off just as we were, without a rucksack, without anything. Henny from the bakery, who always has her nose to the wind, came running behind us. The sun was burning, and the shooting started up again, very faintly. We ducked, hurrying along close to the buildings. Some grey-haired soldiers, probably Volkssturm, were crouching on the curb by the corner. They were resting their heads on their knees. They never even glanced at us. A crowd outside the barracks with baskets, sacks, bags. I run inside the first hall I come to. It's dark and cool and completely empty, evidently the wrong one. I dash back, hear people ahead of me groping and gasping, then someone shouting, "Here! Over here!" I grab a crate that's lying around and drag it behind me. Feeling my way, I bump into some people and get kicked in the shin. All of a sudden I'm in a basement that's completely pitch black, full of people shrieking in pain. A boxing match in the dark. This isn't distribution, it's sheer plunder. Someone switches on a torch. I can see shelves with cans and bottles, but only down below. The upper shelves have already been cleaned out. I bend over, drop to the ground, rummage in the lowest compartment, pull out 5, 6 bottles, and stuff them in my crate. In the dark I get hold of a can, but someone steps on my fingers, and a man's voice shouts, "Those are mine!" I leave with my things, head for the door, go into the next room. There's a faint shimmer of light coming through a crack in the wall. I can make out loaves of bread, rows and rows, once again only on the lowest levels. I grab a few, kneel back on the ground and grope and dig for more. I'm kneeling in a pool of wine, you can smell it. Shattered glass is everywhere. I cram all the bread I can inside my box. Since I can't lift it anymore, I have to drag it out through the door, into the corridor and towards the exit, which beckons at the other end of the dark tunnel like a brightly lit stage. Outside, I run into the baker. He has also managed to get some bread and packs it into my box. Then he hurries back for more. I stay right by my crate and wait. He comes back with canned food, porcelain plates, coarse towels, and a ball of bright blue knitting wool, very frizzy and felted. All at once, Antoine the Belgian is there, the little baker's apprentice, with a leg of beef, and then Henny with chartreuse in thick-bellied bottles. She's angry. They have everything inside, everything. Coffee, chocolate, brandy. They were living it up all right, that little band of brothers. And she disappears back inside. I guard my crate. A man comes up. He's made his jacket into a sack to carry several bottles of alcohol. He looks longingly at the bread in my box. "Can I have one of those?" "Sure," I say, "for some brandy." We trade 1 loaf of whole-grain bread for a bottle of Steinhager, both very pleased with the exchange. Wild scenes are taking place all around in the dazzling sunlight. Now and then a few shells hit, 2 of them close. Men smash bottles against the walls, drinking in greedy gulps. Antoine and I each grab a side of my crate and head back. It's full and heavy and hard to carry, so we frequently have to set it down. I am very thirsty and do just like the others. I take a bottle of red wine and smash the neck against the gutter. The ones I got were all French labels. The jagged edge cuts my lower lip. I didn't even notice until Antoine points it out and wipes off the blood with his handkerchief, all the while standing watchfully astride our box. The blood had already dribbled down below my neckline. The baker comes puffing up behind us, carrying the bluish leg of beef, smeared with horse manure, pressing it against him like a baby. The sun is scorching. I'm dripping with sweat. A few close hits. Then, farther off, the tack-tack-tack of strafing and the bang-bang-bang of the light anti-aircraft guns. Outside our house, we divvy up the loot. The idiotic blue wool managed to get into everything. My share consists of 5 bottles of Burgundy, 3 jars of preserved vegetables, 1 bottle of Steinhager, 4 loaves of whole-grain bread, 6 packs of pea flour, which the baker generously gave me from his own stores, and 1 unlabelled can of I don't know what. Now I've lugged everything upstairs to the widow's. Hot and sweaty, I recount my adventures to about a dozen people as I stand next to the stove, plate in my left hand, and wolf down a few spoonfuls of the mashed potatoes that the widow fixed. A number of families have chipped in for fuel. More bombs hit outside. The others are eyeing my loot, but they don't dare go to the barracks, which had undoubtedly been emptied of their plunder by now. Several hours later, around 6 p.m., back in the basement. I was able to get a little sleep, the widow and I having finished the open bottle of Burgundy. When I woke up, I felt giddy, with a bitter taste in my mouth. It took a while to connect to the kerosene flicker of the underworld. Not until I saw people running out and heard them calling for sacks. "Come on! They're taking potatoes out of the barracks." I rush over with the widow. The enemy is taking a break and things are fairly quiet, which explains the sudden mass of people milling about streets normally deserted in the middle of the day. 2 women pass by pulling a child's toy wagon with a whole barrel on top that smells of sauerkraut. Young and very old alike run like mad in the direction of the barracks. The widow and I have grabbed all the buckets we could find, 2 for each of us. The way is strewn with trampled potatoes and rotting carrots. You just have to follow them and you can't go wrong. But right by the stone steps is a patch of blood. I shrink back, but the widow just laughs. "That's marmalade." And that's exactly what it is, too. People are rolling it out by the barrel. We push through the crowd in the corridor, stumble down the slippery steps, land in a stinky pile of rotting potatoes. By the light of the narrow skylights we dig around in the mush with our hands and shoes, picking out whatever we can use. We leave the carrots and muddy swedes and fill our buckets with potatoes. We find a half-filled sack, and without asking whose it is, we grab it and carry it up the stairs, down the street, into our building, and up to the first floor. More rattling and booming. Nobody cares, they're all gripped by plunder fever. We turn round and run right back, this time returning with buckets full of briquettes. Mobs of people everywhere, running and snatching. Now they've begun to loot the abandoned shops as well. A white-haired man, or gentleman would be a better description, is hauling a drawer full of boxes of soap powder. The drawer is labelled rice. Up to the first floor. We sit around on the living-room couch. Our arms are stiff, our legs shaky. What window panes are still left are quivering slightly. A gentle warmth is wafting through the broken windows, that and the smell of fire. Now and then we hear a vroom, then a prolonged echo from the heavy anti-aircraft guns. After that comes a ping, a short blow right to the eardrum, heavy artillery, and then far away an occasional knack-vum, very fast, accompanied by howling and barking. I have no idea what it is. The widow claims they're Katyusha rockets, the so-called Stalin organs. Incidentally, up to now the Russians have been using individual bombs rather than a carpet. In the end, the two of us go off to see whether there's any pudding powder left at the corner store that was hit yesterday. It turns out there are still a few customers, and yes, they're still selling. There's a price printed on the powder, 38 pfennigs, I think. The person selling, who also owns the store and lives right there, insisted on giving every customer exact change, so he kept running up and down the queue asking who had small coins and could help him, and that while under fire. Only here. We'll be counting our change right into the grave. Just for fun, we peeked round the corner to see what was up at the butcher's, since I still hadn't used up my ration. There, too, they were selling, with more supply than demand. At most a dozen people were in the store, so we were able to get some good pieces, boneless pork, fairly weighed. As we walked out of the store, a truck drove by with German troops, red tabs meaning anti-aircraft. They were heading away from us towards the centre of the town. They sat there mute, staring off into the distance. A woman called out to them, "Are you leaving?" No one answered her. We looked at each other and shrugged. The woman said, "They're just poor souls themselves." These days I keep noticing how my feelings towards men, and the feelings of all the other women, are changing. We feel sorry for them. They seem so miserable and powerless. The weaker sex. Deep down, we women are experiencing a kind of collective disappointment. The Nazi world, ruled by men, glorifying the strong man, is beginning to crumble, and with it the myth of man. In earlier wars, men could claim that the privilege of killing and being killed for the fatherland was theirs and theirs alone. Today, we women too have a share. That has transformed us, emboldened us. Among the many defeats at the end of this war is the defeat of the male sex. Later, in the basement, intelligent conversations over supper. Cosy still lifes, in 1 square metre per household. Here tea with bread and butter, there mashed potatoes. Stinchin, with the Hamburg's S, wields her knife and fork flawlessly as she pokes at her pickle. Her wounded head has been neatly bandaged. The book-selling wife asks, "May I serve you some?" "Yes, please, if you'd be so kind," answers Curtinman Schmidt softly. A towel is spread over the canary's cage. The deserter comes and announces that the Russians are scouting out the cinema. Our corner is currently under fire from small guns. The ex-soldier tells us we can't have anyone wearing a uniform in the basement, otherwise, under martial law, we'll all be subject to execution. Palaver about the notices in the Armoured Bear. 2 armies really do seem to be heading to relieve Berlin. Schöner from the south, and some other one from the north. Toynbreetzen, Orianenburg and Bernau are said to have been liberated. And us? Very mixed feelings, and a sense of fright. So now they'll be back and forth, and we're caught right in the middle. Are we supposed to stay here for months? We're lost, one way or the other. If things don't work out for Ivan, then the Americans will come from the air. And God have mercy if they start in with carpet bombs. We'll be buried alive in this basement. A new announcement from the street. The Volkssturm has retreated. Ivan is pushing right towards us. German artillery has pulled up on our corner. The explosions are booming through the basement. Meanwhile, 6 women are sitting round a little table. The widow is reading the distiller's wife's cards. She's very good at it, too. In the short run you will experience a disappointment in connection with your husband. He's still holding his post in the distillery, together with the red-headed Elvira. I want to go to sleep, right away. I'm looking forward to it. The day's been packed to the brim. The net result, I'm healthy, bold and bright. For the moment my fear is mostly gone. My brain is full of vivid images of greed and rage. Stiff back, tired feet, broken thumbnail, a cut lip that's still smarting. So the saying's true after all. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. One more thing. An image from the street. A man pushing a wheelbarrow with a dead woman on top, stiff as a board. Loose grey strands of hair fluttering, a blue kitchen apron. Her withered legs in grey stockings sticking out the end of the wheelbarrow. Hardly anyone gave her a second glance. Just like when they used to ignore the rubbish being hauled away. Friday, 27th of April, 1945. Day of catastrophe, wild turmoil. Recorded on Saturday morning. It began with silence. The night was far too quiet. Around 12 o'clock, Fräulein Bain reported that the enemy had reached the gardens and that the German line of defence was right outside our door. It took a long time for me to fall asleep. I was going over Russian phrases in my head, practicing the ones I thought I'd soon have a chance to use. Today, I briefly mentioned to the other cave-dwellers that I speak a little Russian, a fact I'd been keeping to myself. I explained that I'd been to European Russia when I was younger, one of the dozen or so countries I visited on my travels. My Russian is very basic, very utilitarian, picked up along the way. Still, I know how to count and to say what day it is, and I can read the Cyrillic alphabet. I'm sure it will come back quickly now that practice is near at hand. I've always had a knack for languages. Finally, counting away in Russian, I fell asleep. I slept until about 5 a.m., when I heard someone wandering around the front of the basement. It was the book-selling wife who had come in from the outside. She took my hand and whispered, "They're here." Who? The Russians? I could barely open my eyes. Yes, they just climbed through the window at Meyer's, meaning the liquor shop. I finished dressing and combed my hair while she delivered her news to the others. Within minutes, the whole basement was on its feet. Taking the back stairs, I felt my way up to the first floor in order to hide our meagre provisions, at least whatever wasn't already squirreled away. Before going inside, I put my ear to the back door, which was in splinters and could no longer be locked. All quiet, the kitchen empty. Keeping close to the floor, I crept over to the window. It was a bright morning outside. Our street was under fire. You could hear the whistle and patter of the bullets. A Russian anti-aircraft battery was turning the corner. 4 barrels, 4 iron giraffes with menacing necks tall as towers. 2 men were stomping up the street, broad backs, leather jackets, high leather boots. Jeeps pulling up to the curb. Howitzers rattling ahead in the early light. The pavement alive with the din. The smell of petrol drifted into the kitchen through the broken window panes. I went back to the basement. We ate our breakfast as if in a dream, although I did manage to consume several slices of bread, much to the amazement of the widow. Even so, my stomach was fluttering. I felt the way I had as a schoolgirl before a maths exam, anxious and uneasy, wishing that it was already over. After that, the widow and I climbed upstairs. We dusted her apartment, wiped down the counters and swept and